Blog Talk Radio.
And welcome to another edition of Carnivore Radio. I'm your host, Jeff Sherman, along with Dr. Eric Lopkin, and we're talking about the subject matter of today's show is social media, the social, political, and overall business implications, and there's no better guest to have than Keith Reynolds. Keith, thanks so much for joining us on Carnivore Radio today.
My pleasure, Jeff. Nice to be back. Thank you.
Awesome. So, let's talk a little bit for our listeners about your histrionics, because it's interesting. Because we talked, obviously, when we were talking about doing this show, we talked about your history, and I've worked with you in the 90s in terms of doing at least internet work.
Yeah.
But your history goes even farther back than that. And let's talk about that.
Yeah,
the way you articulated that was quite good.
Well, I started working for the higher education division of IBM when they were laying the pipe to bring on the research organizations at universities onto the internet, and then building out from that infrastructure. In the early 90s, it became a public utility almost, and you've seen its growth. But yeah, I bought the story hook, line, and sinker early in my career. I've believed in it, and yet when we were talking, it's like, look what it's morphed into all of the good things that we thought it could be back then, but look at all the things that have come along with it as well, some of the more disturbing social implications. So it's been quite a journey over the last 30 years.
Interesting. So before we switch it out to Dr. Lopkin, what disturbs you about the evolution and progression of this very optimistic technology in the early, maybe late 1990s, early 2000s? What disturbs you, Mr. Reynolds?
I early on in that period, I was teaching about the internet at our public library, and I would tell people it's like Main Street. You don't go down Main Street and talk to strangers. You don't go down an alleyway with someone you don't know on Main Street. You don't buy watches from somebody, on the street unless you're really brave, and they probably won't work when you do buy them. And the internet is all of the same. So, there was a warning that I would give people back then. I think what I didn't foresee was more of the implications we have right now, just about how divided and vitriolic that the discussion has gotten.
Let's throw that out to Dr. Lopkin. I have to give him credit for this because he articulated that in our radio show, God, time flies, Dr. Lopkin, I would say 10 years ago. Talk about that in terms of the polarization of people. It used to be, unfortunately, but it beats the alternative. I'm older than both of you, but you could sit down for Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner and have a little discussion. There were some there were some Democrats and Republicans, and all were good, and you had the cranberry sauce, and it's all good. That's changed, Dr. Lopkin, hasn't it?
It really has. I mean, to continue with Keith's example of social media as Main Street, it really did morph from Main Street to the town square soapbox, where it wasn't so much about connecting with the folks that you already knew, which, by the way, the founder of LinkedIn has written a number of articles telling everybody you're using social media wrong. It was meant to connect with folks you already know rather than meeting new people and connecting with folks you don't. But when it became that town square soapbox, it became a very powerful tool for people that didn't have access to the media. So, if you remember, and I know, Jeff, you're certainly old enough to remember this, local stations
Thank you.
used to... No. Well, they haven't done it in a while, but it's in our lifetime. Local stations used to have people on for editorial rebuttals, and it was the average person's chance to address the television audience. That stopped with the fairness doctrine under the Reagan administration, and social media, although obviously not immediately, took its place. It gave everybody that voice, and unfortunately, there was a reason that a lot of people didn't have a voice. Many of them just didn't know the facts about what they were talking about. Many of them were simply, racist or off the wall, and social media suddenly gave them credibility because no matter how out there your ideas were, you could always find somebody else that agreed with you.
Dr. Loppin, amazing
really
point.
Interesting too.
Keith, I was going to throw out to you anyway. Yes, go run with that one. Amazing.
Well, I was just going to say what I don't think I didn't see then was it's the scale. So if you have hundreds of towns across the U.S. and everyone has 20 crazy people that are racist bigots that are scamming people, that's one thing. They're all separated. It's when they're all able to, as LinkedIn said, to get together with people you don't know who do the same thing. It's they get the scale and a platform that they've never had before.
Dr. Lopkin, I'm going to throw out Keith, excellent point. So what Keith's really saying is it used to be this minuscule minority of the 20 crazies. Now they have a platform that makes them not crazies, but mainstream. Talk about that.
They're legit in their numbers.
Yes.
Right, and it didn't happen overnight. Just to give our listeners a little history of this, I mean, before there was social media, and in fact, before there was the World Wide Web, there were computer bulletin board services where these people would gather. There were Telnet and IRC chat rooms. But none of these ever gained traction with the general public. And that was the tipping point. Social media, especially after smartphones became so common, these crazy people now had access to the general public, where prior to this, even in the high-tech world, they were sort of isolated in these little groups.
Great. So let's morph a little bit, Keith, and we're going to throw it out to you. The Social Dilemma has been a big, one of Netflix's major, I think they produced a major viewing audience hits. And it really talks about how social media has influenced people. And let me, before I throw it out to you, 10 years ago, I'll never forget this, it's so strange, both of you, and for our listeners, that I was watching Larry King and Billy Bob Thornton, believe it or not, was on his show. I thought he was just, he made some good movies, but maybe not the brightest bulb in the Christmas tree. But actually, I was completely wrong. 10, 12 years ago, he was saying that social media, we've become disconnected. And this is before this whole phenomenon really even unfolded. We've become disconnected, and basically we've gotten this disproportionate feeling that we are more important than we. In other words, he said we've never been more insignificant, but social media gives us this platform to feel uber significant. Mr. Reynolds?
Whoop, I was on mute. I think that when you give people access to a platform where you have scale and anonymity and distance, it's a very potent combination we're learning, where people do things that they wouldn't do in a family setting, they wouldn't do in a public restaurant, and yet now they feel emboldened and empowered to do things
Keith,
that are
Mr. Reynolds, that's
totally
a great
unacceptable.
point, and I want you to run with that, and then Dr. Lopkin. What you've really just hit on, isn't that at the core essence of what we're talking about, is one thing leads to another. So behavior, which is, I'll use the term, is happening or appropriate, I'm not so sure it's so appropriate, online transcends itself into the public domain, even at the level of connected families. So what was inappropriate, there's no line of demarcation, is my point.
Mm-hmm.
It's grayed to the point that there's what people are doing online, they're doing in person. And
I think that, that titillation that the public feels when they see media is capitalized on by these social media companies, right? They're not they're out there to maximize profit, and they know that these negative feelings that they can stir up in people are the sources of their profit. So they have no incentive to weigh it. And now I think the incentive is they may get put into a regulatory framework more like the fairness doctrine that Dr. Lopkin brought up, where they're going to get regulated. And so you're seeing Twitter and
I love your
and
point.
YouTube now self-regulate before the government steps in.
Mr. Reynolds, great point. Dr. Lopkin, maybe you can shed a little light of what Mr. Reynolds just said. I think he had a really good point.
Yeah, people do feel important when other people hear what they're saying. Social media, actually, it's not just that it gave everybody an audience. It actually gave people for a lot of people is the ultimate combination of having an audience and being anonymous, because you're not looking at somebody face to face. It's hidden behind your computer screen, and all anybody knows is what you're putting up. So the real facts, the real things that you're doing in your life, they're keeping that anonymous while still enjoying the spotlight. So it really is almost a perversion of Andy Warhol's bit that everybody's going to be famous in the future, but only for 15 minutes.
Dr. Lopkin, amazing point. Keith, Mr. Reynolds, before we go to break, can you comment on what the esteemed Dr. Lopkin just said?
It's a great point. We all get our 15 minutes of fame, and then we find ourselves in that brief spotlight where all of a sudden, we're seeing our friends posting the beautiful vacations and the cars and the things that, that we get a feeling of inadequacy when we see other people only posting that one-sided view of themselves. It's a recipe for.
Yes, something, we're going to pick that up after the break, because that's something. Thank you so much for bringing that up, because that's something, gentlemen, and for our listeners out there, that we're going to talk about, because it's got huge implications in terms of mental health and people's perception of what reality really is. But Dr. Lopkin, before you go to break, can you tell our listeners how can they join the discussion?
Yes, if you'd like to be part of the call, you can get us at 563-999-3693. That's 563-999-3693. Call us and join the conversation. And we'll be right back after this message.
To reach the next level, you need to operate at peak performance. The key to this is mastering the 7 elements of success. Learn how to master mindset, focus, operations, communications, innovation, evaluation metrics, and continuous improvement. Get the Biznetics Way at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, and bookstores near you.
And we're back. And remember, if you want to be part of the conversation, you can call us at 563-999-3693. That's 563-999-3693.
Mr. Reynolds, before we went to break, what you articulated is very powerful. And I've actually done some research investigations on that and heard some viewpoints on the whole fact that it sounds like an overreaction, but that's actually led to depression and to the extreme suicides, believe it or not, because people see this social media phenomenon and maybe alternate reality, and they see, okay, I don't know, whatever. I'm living in a house and I have an average job, and you can play out whatever you want. It's really not important. And then you see your friends, and it's not their actual reality, but it's their social media reality, and you're saying to yourself, "Oh my God, what happened to my life?" Please run with that.
Well, I mean, early on we were hearing about radicalization of terrorists, and now we have radicalization just right within our communities of people who, fear is a very real human emotion, and if we're going through tremendously rough times now. If you're not feeling good and you see things out in the media that attract you, and not only is it just one-way media coming at you, you can now interact, with those people and decide to meet up. And I think it unchecked, social media has some really negative things that we've got to address as a society and questions that we have to answer.
No, I agree. And Dr. Locke, before I throw it out to you, it's a long, long time ago. I was watching Johnny Carson and Robert Blake. I know, obviously we know what happened to him. But he was talking about, and I thought it was just phenomenal. He was talking about very benign shows like the Brady Bunch and other things like that, and how he thought that was damaging because people that didn't live in that idealistic world would become very, very depressed. And now it's in a hyper situation, Dr. Lopkin. I mean, that was 30, 40 years ago. I thought his point was more than valid. Now you go to social media and everyone's life is just, a combination of very good and very bad. It's the human experience. But then you get this distorted reality. Please comment on that.
Yeah, it has had an impact going back all the way, to the origins of television, when people it was always said, you let these actors into your living room and you thought of them as part of the family. And when you saw they were living so much better than you, it did have a negative impact. And in fact, that was almost the impetus for the Fox network. Now, I'm not talking about Fox News. I'm talking about the programming network. Because if you remember their original programming, Married with Children, The Simpsons, it was all these dysfunctional families that people could look at and go, well, at least I'm not that bad. And then you saw reality television come about. And the reality started showing, lifestyles of the rich and famous, and then degenerated to seeing, Honey Boo Boo and all of these ridiculous characters. Now you've got social media where the people who are portraying their lives as so great are actually people you know. And so it makes you feel, somewhat depressed, almost inadequate, going, well, I know these people. They're not that much better off than I am. Why do they have so much better lives than I do? And
Dr. Locke is brilliant. Mr. Reynolds, comment on that, because I think that Dr. Lopkin's point is amazing. If you have Jan Brady and blah, 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 whatever the show is, you kind of have an idea that's not real. Okay, you could be 12 years old and you're still thinking, well, the Brady Bunch, my family's got so many problems. My father's unemployed and blah, blah, blah. But to Dr. Lopkin's point, when you have people you graduated high school with and they're portraying the thing, I went on a camping trip with the wife and kids and everything, that's tougher. Is that not correct?
I'm sorry, so what's tougher?
In other words, if it's the Brady Bunch, that's obviously a show. But when you have your friends posting and people you went to high school with or college with, and they went hiking in Appalachia, whatever it is, and things look so, it's a distortion of reality, not intentional. I don't think it's intentional, right. But you're living your reality and you're getting this social media reality. To Dr. Lopkin's point, isn't that more difficult than the Brady Bunch and Marsha doing great, whatever? No. I mean, the technology brings, on the one hand, it brings knowledge, but there's no intimacy, right? So it stimulates negative or distorts our perception and stimulates destructive behaviors for many people. And, when you combine that with a free market, unchecked, unregulated media that is trying to make money at this, and they know that those negative behaviors and emotional feelings actually put money into the P&L of that company, then it just creates a recipe for amplifying the things that are negative and not giving proper attention to the things that are good in society. My dad and I had this argument quite a while ago that he was the greatest generation, a member of the greatest generation, and he said the greatest times to live were in the 1950s, and I was like, Dad, there's a lot of good stuff that's going on right now. I can't raise my kids to think that the best stuff already happened in the 50s. And yet what we're doing now is we're amplifying the negative, or it's getting amplified. And we, I think, lose touch with a lot of the positive things that we have going on as well, social inclusion and diversity. And, we're finally making moves to understand our connection to the environment. And, social media helps that as well. But we're but I think
the systems are geared around the negative emotions that people feel.
I think your father on a social level, I have to agree with him. Let's not get into, the racism of the 50s, the segregation. But I think we've exchanged, as Billy Bob Thornton said on Larry King 15 years ago, we've exchanged real human interaction for this quasi-interaction. I think in the 50s, you sat on a porch, you had a lemonade with your best friend, and I think my point is that human evolution is gone at a certain level, and exponentially technological evolution has happened exponentially. I don't think the human mind has caught up, and I think we still are beings that want real connections. We don't have that now. First, Mr. Reynolds, and Dr. Lopkin.
Well, I just, to your point about what we don't have right now is those social connections. Now in this last year, where we are now socially distant to keep ourselves healthy, I think we're in a situation where it could get even worse, and we have to work even harder to reach out to people and maintain real connections.
Dr. Lopkin.
Yep. It's funny, as you were saying this, I was flashing, there is a comedian, Sebastian Maniscalco, that talks about the difference from when he was a kid and now, when people come by the house. And it was, when we were kids, if a friend, was in the neighborhood, knocked on the door, "Oh, how are you doing? Come in." You had cake, you had coffee. It became a social occasion. Now, when was the last time anybody knocked on anybody's door unexpectedly? It's like you hear the knock on the door. It's like, oh, pretend we're not home. We don't want to deal with this.
That's my whole point about we've become a disconnected society, and we've exchanged real human emotion for a fake cyber connection, which is not going to be fulfilling in any stretch of the imagination. And I think it has real repercussions. Now, to Keith's point, I actually will say on the counter that through this pandemic, social media has probably saved lives, Mr. Reynolds, not the opposite, because people that are quarantined, older, single, what have you, have at least had the opportunity to reach out in a cyber environment. What do you think, Mr. Reynolds?
I think we go back to Main Street, and there's lots of wonderful things and there's lots of bad things. And we as a society have to find ways to amplify the kinds of things you're talking about. And we've also got to really understand this dynamic of this anonymity, distance, and the corporate element that owns these social media platforms that actually benefit from the bad side of things. Not that they're trying to do it, but there's definitely...
it's a natural inclination of the P&L, and that's a fantastic point, Mr. Reynolds, and maybe we might have to close on Dr. Lopkin's comment on that the P&L drivers are maybe accelerating the negative aspects of social media. Could that be happening, the great doctor?
Oh, it could absolutely be happening, because when you're getting into an argument with somebody on social media, you're coming back on and you're signing on more frequently because you want to see if anybody's responding to what you said. Social media has, the need for you to keep coming back because your eyeballs are their product. That's what they're selling to the advertisers.
So they're fueling the fire.
To come back, anything that gets you to come back as often as possible, they want to see happen. Now, I think it's
good, bad,
also very
correct.
Yes, but it's also important to say that social media isn't bad and social media isn't good. It's simply a tool, and it's how it's used.
I agree. Final comments, Mr. Reynolds. Thanks so much for being on the show. Someone that's been doing this for many years and an expert in your field. Your closing thoughts, please.
I'm going to remain optimistic and remain engaged, and I still have a view to a bright future.
Dr. Lopkin.
I wholeheartedly agree. Again, social media is a tool, and we can use it for positive just as much as negative. So focus on the positive.
Gentlemen, I think truly, Dr. Lopkin, this was an amazing show. Your comment on that.
Absolutely. Keith is always a fantastic guest to have.
Keith is fantastic. Keith?
Well, it's a great way to wind up
fantastic.
a week to hang out with you guys. Thanks.
Very high intellectual discussion. Amazing. Thank you both.
And you've been listening to Carnivore Radio. You can hear us live every Friday at 4 at blogtalkradio.com/Carnivore Radio. You can hear the replay as well as the Carnivore Bites podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and wherever you find podcasts. We'll see you next week.
Thank you, Dr. Thank you, Doctor, and thank you, Mr. Reynolds. Appreciate it.
Thank you.